Okay, we're about to start, but we're just missing one person, and I'm sure she's coming very soon. Hello, Xiaolu. I'll just do a few of the typical conference announcements before that, while we're waiting. One is that, once again, we'll be very punctual this session, because we do have a very tight program once again. We have a film screening of Xiaolu's film at lunchtime, and we want to say that we have little sandwiches for people to be able to have their sandwich while they're watching the film, and water, no more, but then sandwiches and water. We weren't allowed. We had to have a big fight about whether we could eat on the premises, but we're doing that. Okay, so you don't have to go out for lunch. You can come in and watch. We have thought about it, and because She, a Chinese is a bit long, we're going to do the one that we thought originally, which is a film about London at night, which is really quite extraordinary. It's only 70 minutes, so that gives us a bit of time to then talk to Xiaolu or go for coffee or as you feel. So there's that. There's also the performance that Amanda Coogan will be starting, which will be on the stairs of the other building where the registration is, and which is a durational performance. So it would be nice to be there at the beginning. We've left that space free so that we can be there at the beginning, but you can pop in and out at any moment during the hours once you'll be there. And I think that's it. And now for those of you who are going to the dinner and who have special requirements, we've prepared little tickets, that you have. We'd like you to collect at registration as well, because then they'll identify you and they won't keep asking who needs the vegetarian, who wants the gluten-free, etc. Okay, so if you don't mind picking those up at registration, and then you can be identified more easily at the dinner table. Okay, right. So I think we'll start straight away, and we have quite a wonderful desk of people here, a panel of writers, of course. I'm sorry that Ellams could not stay. We've had a series of sort of little incidents with flights and things, and he had to change his return flight because something went wrong with his flight coming here, and then you can't do the return, as you know. So he had to leave early this morning. We're very sorry he isn't, because he has a lot to say about cities and the things he organises in London and the Midnight Run, etc. And for those of you who were there last night, in a way the performance spoke for itself, because it was absolutely fabulous. But we're sorry he can't be here, and he is too, but it couldn't be helped. Poor Angie Cruz has just arrived after another cancelled flight because of technical reasons, and so she's trying to keep awake, but she's promised she will for this hour. Okay, and Gillian Slovo has arrived only very recently as well. As you know, they all have had already, or will have today and tomorrow, their own reading sessions. So what we would like to do in these two writers' panels is to address more directly the theme of urban writing, performing, how they feel or write or relate to the city or specific cities. And I've asked them to speak only for a very at most 5 minutes, so that we have a lot of time for you to ask questions and discuss anything you would like with them. Okay, so I think maybe we'll just start in the order you are, so that we can just go in an organized manner, and then when we get to Xiaolu, we'll open the floor to your questions and discussion. So Alicia McKenzie, who offered that wonderful reading and concert the other night, and so you've heard her read, and we'll give her the...
Thank you. Good morning. Cities. So I was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, and I think something that stays with me from growing up in Kingston is the music, reggae, and the music really, really talks about the city and about our lives. So I think every Jamaican writer of my generation has been influenced by that music, by, I call it the beat behind the words, because that beat is always there. And I have a presentation I could have brought that if I'd thought about it. This beat behind the words, how they influence what you write. So, Jamaica, I don't know if anybody has been to Kingston. Besides the music, another defining aspect for me, for people again of my generation, is that period of political. Sorry, I'm too loud.
No,
It's
a bit too close.
okay. So that period of political violence that we all lived through, and we write about that. That's also in the stories where in 1 year, I mean, between 79 to 80, we'd never experienced that before. More than 1,000 people were killed in the political violence. So that's, again, part of the city, because that was happening mainly in Kingston, not so much in other areas. So those two things, just, the city beat, city life, the violence that we live through, I think those are all elements of the writing. And the other thing is the migration from the cities, because we all grew up with people leaving, whether they were going to other cities, in the United States or in England. That was something that was also part of it. Do I have 1 more minute? Okay. And I think, again, another theme in writing, and it's not just in Jamaica, but I think throughout the Caribbean, is madness, insanity. We grew up seeing people on the streets because, of course, the hospitals couldn't take care. We had one hospital called Bellevue, and I have a story set there. But people, mad people, quotation marks, walk the streets. So that was another part of the city, seeing these people on the streets. And I live in Paris now, and it's interesting to see the growing numbers of they call them SDFs, sans domicile fixe, and that is another feature of the city, and it really bothers me. But so it comes out in the writing, I think. Thank you. No, I think
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, the mic, maybe that one doesn't want to be moved, okay? But they're quite good, actually, even if you speak from a distance, okay? I think you'll be fine. So, Josefina Báez, who did a wonderful performance yesterday.
I was born in what it was said to be a city, La Romana, the town, okay? And I moved to New York in 1972. So I have visited a lot of cities, but I know for my everyday that New York is the most spiritual place that I have been. It's the place that I'd have best disciplined. This is where I found my silence, and this is where I write. Obviously, my work, my text is very much formed and informed by the city. I do exercises of memory that I walk from 125th Street in Broadway all the way to Dykeman. Just a memory exercise that I look to both places. And when I arrived there, I go to a restaurant that I really like, the Batidos, and sit and write everything that I remember. I write a lot with lists, and I have been researching. Every 10 years, I go to the same place in New York, and I write the list. And now that I have seen the different lists, now when I talk with sociologists, mainly, we have seen how gentrification have changed the poetry, the found poetry. And I have become the city. I am a city myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josefina. Angie, who I see is awake, Angie Cruz, again I imagine the city will once again be New York, mostly. Thank you.
Hard to follow up that beautiful thing of being a city yourself. So I've written actually my third novel also is set in New York City, because I was born in Washington Heights, New York City. And Washington Heights, for most of my formative years and up until recently, was predominantly populated by immigrants from Dominican Republic. And essentially, like, a lot of my work has obsessively been set and been thinking about this community, in particular, the lives of the women in the community that I felt that weren't really represented either in books or mainstream media. And I felt this urgency to tell those stories. But the reality is, even though I've been writing about this space for so many years, I've actually haven't lived there the past 12 years. I've lived in Texas, and now I'm living in Pennsylvania. And I spend a very large part of my year in Torino, Italy. So the book I'm working on now is set in Turin. And what I've realized is that at first I thought, I'm obsessed about Washington Heights because it's a place I've thought of as home, but at the same time, I've never felt at home there because I was always othered in some way. But now, looking at the body of work that I've done, I felt like what I'm really excited about when I write about cities is more about the underground economies of the working class. So I see that consistently is not only is like how people hustle their way in surviving particular kinds of challenges coming from the struggling class or the working class or the underclass, but also the ways that women resist patriarchy around, the constraints, like work around those constraints that exist, is particular for brown women. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm so sleepy, but I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, I think it made perfect sense. So. But thank you very much for that effort, and Gillian Slovo.
So I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I came to England when I was 12 years old with my parents, who had to go into exile. And when I first started writing, I wrote crime novels, and they were set in my adoptive city of London, where I've lived most of my life since then. But they're very much the view of an outsider in London, which I think England's quite a hard country to feel that you belong. And it took me a long time. And I think, so my detective was Portuguese in order to conceal the fact that she was actually me. And after I had finished writing crime, I went back to South Africa in my fiction. And after I had gone back to South Africa, I went all over the world. I went to Leningrad of the 30s. I went to Khartoum of the 1880s. I went to what was then Ceylon, Sri Lanka. I didn't come back to London to write. And I think it's in hindsight how long it has made me to feel English that finally my last book was set in London, in the London that I know, and is a view of somebody who actually does live there. And I think I managed to do that because of two things. One is the change in South Africa. When I first wrote about South Africa in the 1990s, when I went back, I left in 1964, I went back for the first time in 1990, and it was a country I knew intimately because apartheid had pickled it in aspic. It was exactly the same in 1990 as I had left it when I was 12 years old. But since then, since the first democratic election, it's a country that has changed dramatically, and because I'm not there to witness that change, to experience it through my fingertips, I think I can no longer feel that I can write about it. But the second thing, but that didn't mean I couldn't go to Khartoum or Leningrad or somewhere else where I wasn't living. But the second thing that made me write about London was a riot. And excuse me, I've got a South African accent, and sometimes I say rioters, and I don't mean writers. And that's because I have as a sideline to writing novels, I write verbatim plays, which are plays based on testimony, on interviews that I've done and compiled out of that. And I did one on the 2011 London riots that started in Tottenham, basically a race riot that then spread and became a consumer riot throughout Britain. And after I had done this play, I realized that a riot is, in a way, a perfect metaphor for what's happened in London, which is when you talk to people about why people riot, depending on what their standing is in that society, where they live, how much money they have, what their politics are, you will hear completely different things. And what I realized is, living in London as well, as you get onto a tube, I mean, London is a very different London from the one I arrived in. It is much more cosmopolitan than it once was. And when you get on the tube, you look and you think that everybody there, is sort of inhabiting the same space. But if you think about it, you realize they're actually living incredibly different lives. That depending on where they live, how much money they have, what their education is, their experience of the city and the country is completely different, in the same way as people's experience of a riot is. And so that is something that allowed me to finally go to contemporary London and write my last book, 10 Days, which is actually a political thriller, but is in fact set around a fictional riot that happens in the England that is just about to come.
Okay, thank you very much, Gillian, and now Shalu, who you listened to yesterday as well.
Hey, thanks. So I was a village person, as I yesterday commented. So I came from village, grew up in the village, and all my adult life, after I became 20 years old, I spent in 3 capital cities in the north. First, Beijing. I lived in Beijing for 10 years for art school education, film school education. After Beijing, I moved to London, and London more than 10 years experience, another capital city, and then currently moved to Berlin. And I guess, of course, there's a huge contrast between village background, the past, and these 3 northern capital cities, which I think so different. When I came to London, I was, of course, feeling beaten and down because I was in the ugly part of London. As Gillian suggested, London has a totally enclosed community. It's the most cosmopolitan city in Europe, but the most kind of non-penetrative city in Europe. And I think it was very difficult for me to live, although I wrote all my novels in London in English. And then I didn't really love London. I had a really problem with London. And then we moved to Berlin some years ago, but now still half London, half Berlin. But I think that Berlin reminded me of Beijing because the socialist attitude, some sort of hard, the architecture in Berlin reminded me Beijing, and this kind of the East, kind of still the East Berliner, East German people, in the post office, in some kind of, old-fashioned shops, this kind of very hard attitude, speaking 9, East, whatever. And this is like totally reminding me of China and Beijing. And I thought, okay, this hardness is really perfect for me. And and I think I didn't understand in London, like, oh, lovely to meet you, bye-bye. And I thought, it's like,
Didn't mean it.
I didn't mean that. Of course, I'm a foreigner, so I can't criticize maybe because I don't need to be OBE or Queen's Order anyway. So I wrote about these 3 cities, I think, for my last few books, and I think especially the last novel called I Am China, and I was determined to set the central character in London, in North London, in Islington, as a translator who's British and translating all the Chinese love letters and diaries. And also I was determined to have other characters set in China and in America because I thought that the experience of my generation is forced to immigrant, not because of luxury, because of job, because scholarship, because the only chance you can get out to get a job is somehow to apply for some scholarship or get some kind of job application, go somewhere to survive. And So I was very determined to set my characters over there. With, the current book I was working on is about Europe, and it's about those European cities I've lived. In a way, I think as a village person, I have this silly nostalgia, towards the countryside landscape, traditional lifestyle. But I think often I find my nostalgia is unhealthy, or perhaps the whole concept of nostalgia is very conservative, reactionary attitude towards a past life which actually is no longer valid. And I think the whole Brexit, which I experienced the last few years in Britain, and I think in the launch hours you're going to see that film about Britain, I realize a certain kind of very conservative nostalgia about the youth and the past life is no longer to be. And even some kind of fascist attitude, nostalgia about wartime. And that nostalgia also in China, people keep saying, oh, in Mao's time is much greater, much greater. And I think the violence occurred during that time. Do you also love that? Because that presents your youth, your handsome, silly beauty of the youth. So you have this strong nostalgia. And I think I'm fighting between, in me, the country life I used to have, and this kind of harsh city, urban, foreign life now I have. And I think those things come into my books. Yeah.
Okay, I hope I haven't cut them too short now, so that you wanted to say any more, but I think it's a good beginning to let people ask questions. So please, anybody who is interested in asking questions, making comments, even sharing your own city or non-city experience with us, the floor is yours.
All at the same time.
Question there.
Yes, hello. I have a question because you were talking about the different aspects of how women are cities and about how we are women and how we are city persons. Yesterday, Anita used that expression. And you mentioned so many different things that make you connect with the city. But I was wondering also, because you're all there, you're women on the panel, and you're all also, different ages also. So I was wondering of how the perception of a city might change through a woman's lifetime, through living through different ages. Because I think when you're a young woman, you experience a city differently as when you get older. So I would be interested in listening to some ideas or thoughts that you might have on that topic of age.
Okay, I think I'll generally just leave you to start. Whoever is more anxious to start can begin, and everybody can all answer. Or
I guess for me, like the urban experience is quite similar, although the Asian and Europe or America is very different. But the urban experience is really somehow similar. I think last week The Guardian has kind of dedicated 2 weeks of big summary about Chinese cities. There's more than 100 brand new Chinese cities, more than 1 million population. So my little village, I used to grow up, now it's 1.6 million people, And so now it's changed. It's no longer called a village, it's called a city. But the thing is, you grew up there, it was a village, it was peasant, buffaloes, animals, donkeys, and now it's highways. And I think the transition is so radical, it's much more radical somehow what's going on in London last 20 years, or from 70s, from Margaret Thatcher's time, because London remained this poor working class, elite, royal family. It hasn't gone through the real urbanization, in my opinion. So in a Chinese city, from my village to the current city, more than 1 million population, and this is just a generic situation in China. So, for example, a little peasant who used to grow their rice with buffaloes now has to learn, drive taxi and learn how to read all the signs on the highway, and also to learn how to speak English to receive the foreigners, into our little town. And I think that transition is profound, much more profound in a way in your lifetime. And I guess when I came to the West, it was coherent, I was, studying English, you're supposed to know everything about the Westerner, Never mind, they're not the other way around, not vice versa, because we are in a whole homogenized, urbanized experience, which dominated by the white kind of, WASP, this central power, come from the West. Yeah, and for me, this transition was very similar, from village to Chinese city, from China to the West.
For me, ages, give me a whole different angle of the city. The urges are different at every age. At 57, the places that I go, even in Central Park, are different. I mean, I might go to the silent space more than the ice skating, But it's the city. It's what I do at home, more than anything else. And that city, I will find every place that I go.
And my experience is actually slightly different from that, because for a long time I worked from home writing novels, and I didn't really go out into the city in the day. I didn't see a working person's city in the day. But as soon as I started doing these plays, I actually had to go and work with other people, and it was a big shock to see, what people do when they have to go to work, which I had to do, and a huge resentment of how crowded the tubes are. So I don't know whether that's an age thing. It's a circumstance thing, but also I think what happens with age is that you are witness to how much a city changes, and London has fundamentally changed in the time that I've lived there. And just to give you one example, when I was in my 20s, when I'd finished university, I went to London, and I was part of the squatting movement, where we just took over houses and lived there until they, about 15 years, 20 years ago, they made squatting illegal. But I squatted in a bit of Hackney where I lived in a house that didn't have a bathroom, and where the local market used to sell onions and potatoes, and they were quite old. And now this place called Broadway Market is the height of modern youth coffee shop London. It's been taken over not just by the young, because we were young, but by the young with money, because it's close to the city, and that whole area has been transformed. And I think that's what growing older in a city does for you. It allows you to see the present and remember the past at the same time.
Last night, the poet Ellams, yes, he said, I think poetry is the cheapest way of being free. And I think you could say that about age as well. It's the cheapest way of being free. You don't have to worry about certain things so much. I mean, when I was growing up, sexual violence was a big preoccupation in Jamaica, because sexual violence, that was part of the political violence. Women were targeted. So this is something you were always concerned about. And as you grow older, I think within the city, you stop thinking so much about that. I usually go walking in the mornings, and I fell about a week ago, and it was great to see people rushing around to say, "Are you okay?" And I felt my age because it was, but so you get that kind of concern. Yeah, that's one of the things about growing older in a city. Something else I should say, I mean, I don't want to give the idea of Jamaica as being, just a violent place, because people are very generous and very concerned about, when I was growing up anyway, there was that sense of solidarity, concern if you're out as a young woman. I remember men telling me, don't walk there, it's dangerous for you. So there was that as well, people looking out for you. I don't know if that is still the case. I mean, in Paris, I don't have that sense of people looking out so much for kids, but when I was growing up in Kingston, there was definitely that sense of people looking out for younger people.
I'm just going to say something really quick. I feel like everything that's been said is true for me. And the one thing is, like, growing up in New York City and Manhattan, I feel like I spent most of my youth, like, trying to conquer that city in some ways. And I had an insane amount of energy to survive in it and to make my way in it. And as time passes, and there's been such a aggressive gentrification, in particular to the neighborhood that I grew up in, and all the immigrant neighborhoods, that now I'm just like, I desperately want to go back to New York. Like, that's my goal if I could ever get a job there. But at the same time, I want it to seduce me now. I feel like I don't want to sacrifice for it, which is what I felt in my youth was what I was willing to do. And so if I were to call it my lover, it's like now I want it to do more work for me. You know what I mean? Like,
I think my impression of the Western cities, I think after the whole urbanization process, I guess in the West would be those two trends. One is kind of super cities, huge, large cities like London, like Paris, Barcelona, Madrid. And then there would be the middle-sized city. I think, in my view, they will be decayed because the job will remain in the huge super cities, and then the idea of the city-state. And then the countryside will be slightly abandoned, or it made use for some sort of large industry, or totally abandoned. I mean, at least that's my impression of Western urbanization. Now, with a country like China or India, because it's large population, the cities cannot completely take those population. So that's why I think something like in China, there's more than 100 media-sized city, more than 1 million. Or, most of the city more than, the big cities, most of the city more than 4 millions. Like my province, the little capital town, more than 5 million easily. And I think that's, probably the third word, urbanization. It still would have possibility to have media-sized city, to consume the job and the population. So I guess in Europe or in the West would be slightly maybe worrying, because what do you do with all the population? Either they abandon in the countryside or they have to live in the super city to adapt to this crazy kind of work life.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question here at the front. Alberto.
Thank you so much. My comment and question are inspired by Gillian's comment about London and difference, and how even when you share the same spaces, the difference of the person in front of you is so sheer and so prominent. And I wanted to take you back to Johannesburg, because your comment reminded me of Nadine Gordimer's first novel, The Lying Days, in which Helen, the character that's partly based on Gordimer herself, goes to university, and it's only when she encounters a black student in a toilet and she looks at her in the mirror as she's washing her face that she discovers her common humanity, and she thinks, actually, this girl is just like me, she's just a girl at university. But she tries to get to know her in the novel, and she fails to know her, because obviously their lifestyles are completely different. She can't go to Soweto where she lives. She can't know the mundane everyday experience of this black girl. So I was wondering, how do cities provide you opportunities to meet others and people of different backgrounds, but what are the limitations as well of getting to know them when the encounters can be so fleeting and you can't know the everyday experiences of everybody?
Well, I think one of the things that has happened certainly in cities in South Africa is that, first of all, they're still racially segregated, but they're racially segregated because of issues of class and money. So there is now a burgeoning black middle class, which probably has very little to do with the bulk of the black population who are as deprived, if not more deprived, in their lifestyles. And I think that must be what is particularly unknowable in somewhere like South Africa is the fact. If you look, for example, at a city like South Africa, as a city like Cape Town, which has got a mountain and a sea, and the net result of the mountain and the sea is it's got a city that cannot expand in its center, and that is the white city that can't expand, and around it it's got what they call the former townships, but are still the townships, which are vast majority black. And so although some of the African middle class might have moved into the white city, that still exists in that country geographically. I don't know if I'm addressing what you're talking about. Yeah.
I am that person that is disadvantaged. Yeah? So then I didn't consume myself, and now with conscience, I had to survive. I have to survive in the present too. So I never fought to be included. In fact, my exclusion and the invisibility that I have had gave me who I am today. So I created my own system of working. I created my silences, and I created my certainties. So that's my city.
Other questions? Yes, sorry.
Hello, morning. I'd like to ask Gillian about what it meant to perform the riots in London in a space where probably people that have participated could have attended the play, and how you felt through the process of it, and how, because I think that theater has that capacity of making people interact. It's a kind of audience, and especially because your play has to do with, it's very much the process of what happened. So I'm interested in just what was your impression, how you felt in that process, how the city becomes a stage, and also the audience is part of the stage as well. Okay, thank you.
What was actually interesting about that was that the play The Riots played in two places, one of which is the Tricycle Theatre in Kilburn, which is not the fanciest area, and which saw some of the spreading riots, but not major one. And then after it had done 3 weeks there, it moved to the Bernie Grant Arts Centre in Tottenham, and Tottenham was where the riots started. And one of the things about these verbatim plays is we quite often, 3 or 4 times a week, would have discussions after the play had finished. And those members of the audience who wanted to stay did. And sometimes we had people on the stage giving a brief, having a brief discussion and then opening it up to the audience. And what I thought was absolutely fascinating was the tone of the discussions in the Tricycle versus the tone in the Bernie Grant Arts Centre. And in the Tricycle, the discussions were somewhat abrasive, I thought, because there were people in the audience, some of whom had experienced the riots as seeing themselves as victims of rioters, and some of whom hadn't, but who felt they had an understanding of why the riot had broken out. And there was a quite a bad-tempered feel to the audience in the way that they discussed it. You don't know what it's like, you don't know what it's like. When it went to the Bernie Grant Arts Centre, it was completely different, because I think the bulk of the audience there had a much greater understanding about what had happened in Tottenham, and they didn't want to discuss why it had happened, because there was consensus of why it had happened. For them, it was about the way the police treated the community, and the fact that yet another black man had died by police hands, and the police had failed to come and tell his parents, and they didn't think it would be properly investigated. That was the consensus. What they wanted to discuss is how to change it and how to make it different. And that, I think, was absolutely fascinating, of what different audiences can do. And I had this experience once before, because I made my first verbatim play was on people in Guantanamo, which was also started in the Tricycle, and then it went to the West End in London. And again, the audiences were completely different. In the Tricycle, people were very angry about what was happening. In the West End, people were sort of more like bemused and not wanting to discuss it. And then it went to New York, and that was a very difficult experience for me, actually, because in New York, I felt that the audience felt shame and was very depressed when they left, which is actually an awful thing to do to an audience. So, well, no, because I think the anger is more motivating than the depression. The depression is a kind of acceptance. anyway, so it did teach me that audiences are very different and they change plays.
So, anybody else who wants to comment on similar experiences or another question? Okay.
I wonder if the panel might comment on what sort of voice or rhythm or beat of the city that they live in draws them, if at all. I'm struck by how both Gillian and Xiaolu talk about the impenetrability of London, and Angie and Josephina seem much more engaged with New York, and yet Gillian has written about the riots. So is there any particular sound or feeling about those big metropolises that catch you as writers?
I guess this is really, I think, up to your background. I guess our background is so different where you come from, and then how you've been accepted into the city as a foreigner is so much shadowed by your past, or determined by your past. I mean, for me, because China was so modernized in the last, say, 30 years, we live in a brand new world in China, although we had such a long history. But history is not in front of our face at all. And after the revolution and the modernization, everything's from last 10 years. This kind of shining plastic reality. So that was like huge kind of leap when I came to London. Was everything is very ancient, and even the social system is ancient. I mean, because we killed the king and the queen, and we killed all the landlord, not long ago. And when you come to London, everyone's worship. Not everyone, but lots of people worship king-queen system. And the royal family cannot be, having a bad media report on the newspaper or on the BBC. And I think once I realized that, I realized it's fundamentally opposite culture. Don't mean bad or good, it just means I didn't prepare enough to enter that city. And I think that was very alienating experience for the first 10 years. And when I had a visa problem, stateless problem, all this immigration problem, then your relationship with the city become very hostile. And that would reflect on your work. And then after all this miserable experience, then you I think, have very subjective attitude towards other city. When I moved to Berlin, Berlin has a very different attitude to receive you because you were legalized in Britain. You are part of European Union. Then I was legal in Germany. And then, the German state treat you as some good artist from the East. So I think this is so subjective how you end up in another city. Yeah.
You go together.
Okay. Okay. Well, I was going to say that I teach creative writing in the United States, and one of the things I always say that I use myself in my own writing is I think about every character has their own soundtrack, and I compose a soundtrack for each of my characters. And what I feel like when I think about New York City in particular and the neighborhood I grew up in is that I grew up in a multilingual home, right? So that changes the beat. There's a lot of code switching. Even when I speak in English, I might be thinking in Spanish. So that changes the sound of the work. But also there's a juxtaposition or like the kind of like pushing against, the African-American community, the Latino community, the Jewish community all together in the same community, kind of all of that, the music of the language, the music itself, all of that sort of, I think, is a very special thing that could happen when you're writing within a city, because it's not homogenous. It's like definitely something where you're constantly negotiating how these things are overlapping and also influencing each other. So,
yeah, definitely, I agree, and I accept it. Is the sounds, the silences, all the accents of language that I know, language that I don't know, and the one that I create and I dance and sing to, that write me, and I write on them. There's this inner rhythm, and that is the bass, and that goes into rapping with everything that I dance with, dance as life. Everything in the city that I experience has a very specific rhythm, and it's really in it. I listen a lot. I mean, listening is very important in my, especially for my delivery of the text. I'm informed with the sources and accents. I love accent, and I can go to Harvard, Texas. You know, it's like I love it all. That information then is a base. That's the school for me. How jazz, the phrasing in jazz, the use of just vocals and consonants, and the amazing thing possible. Or Ellams in India, the southern and northern music in India, the phrasing of the vocal phrasing. Yep, all sources.
Alicia, since I think you started the question of the beat.
The beat. Well, we had a very Eurocentric education, my generation. Shakespeare, Milton, Cervantes. One of my favorite books was El Pícaro or something. I can't remember the author, but anyway. So it was that Molière, that kind of thing. We went, and that was how it was at good high schools when I was growing up. So who told us about our lives? I mean, while we were reading about the man from La Mancha, the people who told us about our own lives were the singers, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh. So the music was very important. And it still is important when I'm writing. Not that I sometimes I do listen to music when I'm writing, but it's somehow the beat, it's always there. Bob Marley, and I don't want to sound like a cliche here. I mean, but he was very important. And the lyrics from songs like Johnny Was a Good Man, woman, hold her head and cry, her son has been shot down in the streets and died. That was telling what was going on, not the books that we were reading in school. So that was very important. In Paris, I think, yes, the music is there, and I listen to French rap. But I think what more informs just day-to-day living, for me anyway, I can go to an art exhibition every single day in Paris. There's so much art, and that I'm writing more and more about artists, visual artists. So there's that.
And for me, I think is slightly different is the way that I think about this question is in terms of voice. Because when I first started writing, I wrote in the first person, and the voice was very strong of this person who wasn't me. And since then, I have technically worked at having different voices in my book. And now that you've asked the question, it has occurred to me that is possibly something about living in a city and coming face to face with all these different lives and different voices, that I'm trying in some way to encapsulate that in my fiction, to talk about different experience through different kinds of voice.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, which we are always sorry about, and I see that we've had an audience so far that always wants to continue, but I think we have to keep to schedule a little bit because we do have a very full day. Thank you so much for your presence here, for even those of you who've just arrived, and thank you for all your thoughtful comments, and obviously for everything you've written before and done before, which is what has had you invited here and what we have enjoyed so far. And we'll keep on conversing throughout the days that are left. Thank you very much.
Thank you.